This is the Storyworks Roundtable, where we have conversations about craft, because becoming a successful author begins with writing a great story. This week on the Storyworks Roundtable podcast, we've got part 2 of our conversation with Kavita Das, all about her book, Craft and Conscience. We go deep into different aspects of craft. It's a fantastic conversation that applies equally to fiction and nonfiction writers, and I know you're going to really like Kavita. She was so fun to have at the round table. Also, she's got some workshops coming up in the very near future, so you'll want to listen to the end and grab those details. And while you're watching or listening to us, please comment, like, share, review us. It helps us so much. We really appreciate it. And the more people joining in the conversations here at the round table, the better. Thank you. Now please enjoy this week's episode of the Storyworks Roundtable with Kavita Das. You talk about the dual responsibility of being compelling yet truthful. I think we've just talked about the compelling nature of individual stories and how invested we get, but how do we balance being compelling and truthful? And do you have any thoughts on fiction versus nonfiction and how we might approach it as writers?
That's a really good question. So, the honest question is it depends. It depends on who is writing and whom you're writing for. So each writer has to, for each piece, decide what is the balance they are trying to strike. This was something I had to go through because I came from the social change space. I was writing policy briefs and all of this. And the truth of the matter is, if I continued to write like that, nobody would want to read it. And that's the honest truth. And that was a hard truth for me to face. Having said that, when I tried to write completely with only the narrative in mind, I felt sometimes like I was compromising too much and I was not doing justice to the issue. And, these sometimes were discussions with myself. Sometimes these were discussions with editors because they're thinking about their readers. And so you have to really find what you are comfortable with, but be aware that there's, that this balance. Now, I think that the issues of writing with conscience apply to all writing, but I don't know if they apply equally, I think, or in the same ways. So nonfiction is, very much based on fact, and so that is, there is a higher bar for that. And we've seen some of issues crop up, over time where people really blurred, the line, writing something as memoir, and then it turned out it wasn't true. So, yes, maybe you can, combine characters, or you can play a little bit with timelines a little bit for condensate, to condense things. But there are rules. And with fiction, I think it's trickier because you have to rely on essentially narrative and dialogue to give context to an issue. So it's, I think, a trickier endeavor because you really have to. But I think it. We've all read books where we grew from the book. Not only did we learn about the character story, but we learned about a whole other part of the world, a whole other group of people, sometimes people who live like literally across town. And we grew, and we had, and when I say grew, I mean intellectually, yes, but I think our empathy grew in a way that even when we might be consuming a lot of news stories, some of it just doesn't hit us in the same, in the same way. And that's what I have a real appreciation for.
Definitely. I think when I'm writing fiction, of course, I'm focused on the emotional truth. And then the factual truth falls into place in things like setting and, the believability, the verisimilitude of like in historical fiction, the technology or the way something would be done. But then it's that emotional truth that connects to the reader. And I find so often in my research, I discover stories of things that happened to real people, and then I borrow from it. So I might have a minor character who's inspired by this thing I read about in some obscure piece of historical research. And it's really fun to look back at those works and say, oh yeah, this thing that really happened, or this thing, something just like this happened to somebody in the past. And I think as readers, we connect through the sense of truthfulness, right? Even if it isn't the factual truth, we can go point to.
Yeah. And I think that, some students who are struggling with, I want to write about this thing that happened to me, but I have, issues of stigma and family. And so one of the things I talk to them about is to explore fictionalizing, which can be an opportunity to just continue to explore, but not feel so worried about the outcome, and also not so compelled by the existing narrative, by the constraints of the existing narrative. So I think that's, one really important thing. And then the other thing is, research was something that even in the biography really scared me. I'm not an academic with a PhD. So it's like, how much research is enough research? How much research is too much research? It's this kind of walking the line. And then also, I think one of the things, and I wrote a piece about this for the Los Angeles Review of Books, and it was more focused on biography, but I really think it applies generally. And it's this question, it was around, all of these issues of questions of cultural appropriation, coming up. And I'm somebody of the mind as a creator that I believe, most people can write about most things, and maybe all people can write about all things, and that's, I'm not somebody who believes in censorship. And so, and at the same time, I know that, something that's missing in a lot of the conversations and debates is that there is not equity in the literary and publishing realm. So I think some of this is based on the fact on not who can, but who gets to. And so if we were really in a place where things were more equitable, I really think we would see less of this, debate. That being said, I do think authors they should be held accountable if you write outside of your identity experience and it becomes really clear that the research is not there. Or another thing that's important is, what do we define as research? And it's amazing to me. I've actually seen this happen a lot. And I think it's a very easy trap to get into, which is that, someone writing from outside of their experience and identity gets a whole bunch of books that are also written by people who are outside of that identity. And because that's been the legacy, right? That's what we have to work with, the libraries are filled with. So we have to really work against that, to say, okay. And then this question of honesty and authenticity is really important, because I people will point to stacks of book and they're also not written from within that perspective. So that's a whole topic that I talk about in the book.
Yeah, and I really appreciate the stance that everybody can write about whatever character or topic we want to, with the caveat that we come to it from a place of compassion and sincerity and understanding, and then we do the legwork, that research piece and finding sources that are, ground level source material that aren't 1 or 2 or 3 steps removed from the sort of experience that we're trying to write about. I had a student some years ago who wanted to write a children's book about a historical figure who was not of her identity, and she was feeling very squirmish, like, do I have the right to write this? And I thought, well, if you don't write it, maybe nobody will, because right now you have so much love for this historical person and so much desire to tell this story and to bring this person's story to light. I mean, that's a gift. And so when done well and when done appropriately, right, that if we don't share our experiences, who will, right? Our loves and our passions. And
I think that the thing that gets, and it goes back, and that's why I say it's like, it's usually not discussed within this context. What is sad is that if it's an overlooked figure, oftentimes it's like, oh, we have the book on that. That book's already been written. So we will have 400, I don't even think that's an exaggeration. I think that's biographies about Abraham Lincoln. But we cannot have 2 biographies for children on this figure, one from someone who's from within that community who brings just a different lens on what this person meant to them, versus someone who feels strongly about this guy, but maybe discovered them later in life through their academic research or, whatever. And both are important is the thing. I mean, and so when we are arguing for either or, it's actually sad, because what we want is and we want abundance. The more stories that we have, the more textured view we have of this, individual. And, and the question is, do they deserve that? And do readers deserve that? And I think they do. And I'm talking about all readers. So I just think sometimes the conversation that we end up having is doesn't serve the broader literary world at all.
Definitely.
I really appreciated when you were dealing with that subject, because we've talked off podcast before about how would we approach this, how do we talk about it. So when your book came across our laps, we were like, oh good. A system of talking about the conscience of writing, right? That's the whole point. But I loved that. I feel like I now have sort of a set of principles that I can look back and apply to my work to be able to say, yes, check. I did do what I needed to do in order to feel like I did it in a way that was serving the people I'm writing about, right? Instead of just being in this, like, I don't know how this is going to work. So it was nice to have kind of that set of guiding principles to be able to apply as I looked at my own work.
That's great. That's really like what I was hoping for. That's so wonderful.
Yeah. Why don't you give us a list for listeners who maybe haven't read the book yet of some of those key guiding principles? I know we've touched on a lot already, but would you mind just sharing some of your...
I think that, it's hard to just, distill it, because even for the chapter, I went hard, I kind of, it was a choice between running for the hills or going hard. And so, I had written a few essays, like the one that I was mentioning in Los Angeles Review of Books. And, but I really was, that's why that chapter is actually a bit different than the rest of the book. Most of the rest of the book, there are pieces that you are reading that you're just looking for the principles, in the chapter, applied, and I help to dissect them. So I say, this essay you're going to read, this is what it's going to do, and this is, how it works, and see how in this essay they emphasize context, and give you a lot of background information, and and then in this essay, they sometimes by the same author, they're writing about this, and they're focusing on the narrative elements, the storytelling. They're starting with a scene, they're ending with a scene. There's a lot of dialogue, So that's how it's typically laid out. In this chapter 6, on avoiding cultural appropriation and understanding cultural sensitivity, I decided to bring in, big guns, and there were folks who had written essays about this topic. And I really wanted to really use the lessons that they provided. So they all say, various things, but they essentially harken back to what we've, talked about today, is really hit pause is key, and so if you're, and I think this is one of those times where the disconnecting writing versus publishing is really important, because usually if you don't hit pause and go back to the very beginning principle of what is my motivation here, why do I feel strongly about writing this, why does it need to be me that writes this, does it, or maybe it does need to be me because that this person risks continuing to be obscured by history, and or maybe maybe this is a time where I partner with somebody else to tell this story. And, what could that look like? What would I bring to the table and what would they bring to the table? So I think there's, it's like where there's a challenge, there's also an opportunity. And I think, in my piece there, I say, understanding, doing the research is important, but then unless, as I said, what is that research and entail? Does it include authentic voices and from within that community, and realizing that again there can be another book that's written afterwards, maybe from someone from within that community that will shed different light, and that's actually what we want if we are very invested in that story being told. So I think one of the challenges that is there on the reverse side for marginalized writers of color, is sometimes by the publishing, industry, is this pressure to explain. And, you had this great program on backstory, and the subtleties of, when do you explain character's backstory? If you try and do it all up front, nobody's going to read the book, so you need to like layer that in. When do they need this information? How is it relevant? And so it comes back to the point I make in the book or early on, which is there's the writer, there's the reader, and then there's the subject, and seeing not these things in opposition, but that there's a tension that between these things. You can't satisfy all of them, and you have to kind of make choices. That's really the main thing, is making choices. So if the writer understands who is the intended reader for this book, and here is where there might be a difference of opinion between the writer and the publisher. The publisher wants to say everybody's the reader because we want to make all the money. No, I don't mean to ask them as, but they're thinking about, they're thinking about marketing, they're thinking about, they're thinking about all the different opportunities for the book, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing when that gets in front of the intentions, of the book. So perhaps this book is, so what do you think readers already know about this issue? What do they, your intended reader? So what do you feel is your responsibility as a writer to inform about this issue? And I'm talking like for fiction, for example. So you already have a responsibility to the set of characters and the story and all of that. If you try to add to that a responsibility for filling in all the historical details of this event that happened, it's like a boat, it sinks. And so I even have students who are nonfiction writers who feel like if they get an opportunity to publish, they feel like, even academics feel this way, like they have all this research, they want to put it all in this one piece.
Right.
And that's like a great way to sink the piece. Suddenly you're like, wait, what is this piece actually about? It feels like one big, research project, because the writer feels compelled to share everything they've found out, in this one piece, as opposed to saying, you know what, I'm going to tell you this story about this particular aspect of this social issue. And this is going to be hopefully a teaser to the reader to find out more, maybe through my next article, or just to be aware of this issue.
Did you miss the live creative writing workshops I held this fall? If so, don't worry, they are still available as pre-recorded, self-directed workshops at storyworksfiction.com. You can get writing backstory into your now story, weaving together character, plot, and theme, and making your readers fear and fear for your characters today. Each 3-hour writing workshop includes examples, discussion, exercises, and you benefit from the students who did attend live, their questions, my answers, the group discussion. Give yourself a writing treat. Sign up today at storyworksfiction.com. Yes, I love how the questions you were giving us as guiding principles harken back to that question of why do I write to begin with? You know, what is drawing me to this subject or to this social issue or to these characters I want to write about? And if we do the work of some self-examination, then I think that can be our compass that guides us through the way we approach the narrative, the subject matter. And, you're just talking about sinking the ship with too much information. And I wanted to point out you've got a chapter in here on balancing the contextual information with the narrative that is so helpful.
Yeah, I even put a graph in there.
Yeah.
Visual person. That's the only graph in this. I mean, it's basically the only graph, but it was an aha moment for me. Like, I literally doodled that years ago and was like, oh, this piece is for this outlet, so I don't need to do all of that. That's not what, and when I realized it liberated me, as someone who comes from my background, I feel sometimes a lot of responsibility for, that this piece has to explain it all, do it all. And I would hit walls because of that, or I would have very compassionate editors who would say, maybe dial it back. And, and I'd say, oh yeah, okay, yes. So I just want to share, like my students are so passionate. And so I completely relate to that. But in the class, I'm wearing the writing teacher hat. And so I have to kind of say, yes, maybe not all of this up front, and then I kind of show them how it could be staggered along the way. And, I think about it as like Hansel and Gretel, and you have these like, these treasures that are found, along the way. And, and that's why the end of the book is like the bookend, so the beginning is about motivations and the end is about thinking about, again, ideally before the work is out in the world, but what, there's what our motivation is, but what do we think this can do out in the world? What do you think it will look like, out in the world? And so, and usually we tend to think of only the positive, but I, wanted to push us to think about the possible negative things that could blow back, whether it's to us or to who we've written about, that community. I think it's really important so that we can best prepare ourselves for that. Because I've seen, fellow peers and other writers who weren't prepared. And it's very hard to navigate in that situation.
Right. Do you have an example and maybe some tips for how to navigate, or just even a fictional illustration of, for instance?
Yeah, I think it's just, in your, we make these outlines for the book. And I think we can do the same thing for the planning of the book. Like, so before we get into the narrative, it's literally taking some time to draft our motivations. Why do I want to write about this? What do I hope? What do I fear? What do I ultimately want to see happen through this? What would that look like? What am I worried about? If I'm writing about, real people, how am I going to prep them for this being out in the world so that they are not caught sideways? How do they feel about privacy issues? Like if you don't know that, then that's a problem. Like these, it shouldn't be. But I also say this just because, I wrote a piece and it started with a rant online, and it was, and then a friend, actually Jakira Diaz, who has 2 pieces in this, said, "That's an essay." And I was like, "What?" Okay. So I went off and wrote the essay, and then I was like, "What do I do with this?" And she's like, "And where should I send it?" And she's like, "Send it to the Atlantic." And I was like, "Ha ha." And I sent it to the Atlantic, and they took it. And, and then they published it. It was about, not romanticizing, I was pushing back on this whole meritocracy thing of, only the best things get, published. And, and that's just, and I was like, no, I beg to differ, given, what I've been doing before coming to writing and in my observations. And I really wanted to say that, yeah, there's implicit bias, there is systemic racism, and, and it's evidenced by I know it's a very nice fantasy to think that you could have such a lack of diversity and inclusiveness in the industry and then come out with just the most amazing diverse and inclusive books. It doesn't work. And so that's what the piece was about. And, it went viral and writers were sharing it, discussing it. And I was like, wow, oh my God. And I hadn't thought, I just wrote it because I felt compelled, but it all happened so quickly. And, generally it was fine. But then I made a mistake. I did a search and I found like a Read It thread, and there were these comments where it was like, "Oh, this is another writer of color whining about," and it was just like all these negative comments. And I was like, oh my goodness, they're talking about me. And I don't know why I didn't think that was going to happen. I mean, I should have been prepared for it. And luckily it was not like, but it have still affected me. I hadn't prepared myself for that. And I think that, I should have been prepared. And in some ways, when you prepare, you might even put that into your piece, be like, and before you call me this, before you, say that, I'm going to, but the upside is I tend to try and have a sense of humor about things. And I turned that into a McSweeney's humor piece, asking editors to please consider when to send rejections. And, through the whole calendar year. And of course, it turns out there's no good time for rejections. So, please not before and it's because, of course, I got like a rejection, like, I forget if it was on Christmas Eve or the day after Christmas, but it was brutal, right? It was like, why did you think this was a good idea, to send a rejection, or it was on January 1st, like the first of the year, and then I thought, when would I be happy about a rejection? Never. So,
no.
So like I tried to turn my kind of, turn that into a positive thing, but sometimes obviously these are really fraught times, and I actually, and they're very divisive, and it's not about just disagreeing anymore. People are really brutal. And so I think it's really important for writers to be prepared for that and make sure that, and also when we're writing about ourselves, as I said, that was a very difficult thing for me. And I want to make sure that if people are writing about their vulnerabilities, that they're prepared for that to be out in the world. And that's something I don't feel like is being emphasized in the creative writing world, in the MFA world, or, in those classes. It's a lot of speak truth to power and tell your truth. But, what if you have family blowback? What if, you are cut off from like, those are things that, some things you can never be prepared for, but at the very least, I'm seeing it daily on Twitter from, sometimes established writers who are truly shocked by the response by people close to them. And I'm like, oh, wow, like I don't know if they didn't think through it or what. And I don't know that in this question of, oh, do you share things beforehand? Those are deeper questions, and they are, for each circumstance, they're different,
Right.
Whether you share your work with the subject, especially if it's somebody close to you, or these are difficult questions.
They are.
Kathryn, any thoughts or questions before we wrap up?
I don't know that I have any thoughts or questions. I did want to say I very much enjoyed reading your book, and it was a good and thought-provoking experience for me. And I'm going to go back and look at those essays closer that you use as examples, because I was kind of skimming a little bit toward the end, but it was a really good opportunity for me to learn. And I appreciate you taking the time to put it out into the craft realm of, so there you go.
Thank you so much for reading it and reflecting on it. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, thank you for writing it and for including the essays we've mentioned from so many other authors and using them to illustrate your craft points. It's so nice having so much material to absorb and reflect on and to use to help us think about your craft guidance here. And thank you so much for coming to the roundtable.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciated this conversation and, all that you do to kind of interrogate craft.
Thank you. And tell our listeners where they can find you again, please.
Oh, sure. You can find me online at kavitadas.com. I'm on Twitter at KavitaMix and on Instagram at kavitadas. And I'm continuing to teach. So I'm gearing up to teach my next 6-week session through the Shipman Agency. It's the Shipman Agency and they have a workroom. And so you can take classes there virtually. And I'll be also teaching through Tin House, their online seminar. That'll start in April. And so the details of that are going to be released. I'll put all this information on my website. And, I'm also teaching kind of one day off classes. So day after tomorrow, I'm teaching it virtually through the Politics and Prose bookstore. So I'm, kind of honing in on one principle and focusing on that for a 2-hour class. So if folks are interested, that would be great.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much, Kavita.
Thank you both, Alida and Kathryn. I really appreciate this conversation.
Thank you for listening to the StoryWorks Roundtable. Find all our shows, show notes, and videos at storyworkspodcast.com.